Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to COP26, the opportunities and realities of decarbonisation. This event is hosted by the British Chamber of Commerce, apologies, I have a slight echo here. Let me start again. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to COP26 for the next 12 months, the realities and opportunities of decarbonisation. This session at the Singapore International Energy Week is hosted by the British Chamber of Commerce. Our panellists are joining us from the UK and ASEAN, from right across the energy sector. We have three sections: driving action in the run-up to COP26, making green commercial, and finally, successful decarbonisation projects. I'd like to welcome Her Excellency Cara Owen, the British High Commissioner to Singapore. I'm sorry, I don't know about you, Cara. I have a terrible echo here.
Let's hope I don't. Can you put your thumbs up if you can hear me well? Great. Okay, so thank you so much, Tim, for that introduction and for inviting me to come along today. A massive thank you to BritCham for enabling this, and to SIEW, the organisers. I think BritCham, you're showing fantastic leadership and energy on the issue of climate change and sustainability, and something that I'm really proud to see, including because climate change is a top priority for the UK government. So British ambassadors and high commissioners right across the region, there will not be a single one of us who isn't spending a significant proportion of their time thinking and acting on climate change issues. Here in Singapore, climate and sustainability is one of the 5 focus areas that the UK and Singapore governments have chosen to focus on as part of the Singapore-UK Partnership for the Future. And as COP President in partnership with Italy, the UK is strongly encouraging enhanced commitments in the lead up to the Glasgow COP meeting in November next year to reduce emissions and prevent catastrophic climate change. In the opening video, it used the phrase the new normal. And I think we're all really clear that there's one thing that cannot feel at all normal about this next period of our economic life, and that is that we carry on emitting carbon in the way that we have been. It was really good to hear at the beginning of this week, Minister Chan Chun-Sing set out an enhanced energy strategy for Singapore. We all know, our governments and the private sector, that there is only a short window to take action. Governments can't do this alone. I'm really struck in the conversations that I'm having all the time here in Singapore, that businesses have a major role to play in this effort. In some of the conversations that I've been having with business leaders, sometimes in fact, I've had the impression that businesses who themselves understand the reality of seeking to build value and profitability over the long term are moving quicker than some governments. And that is fantastic to see. And of course, there are huge economic and commercial opportunities associated with green growth. And this roundtable is going to be highlighting some of them. You may have heard this statistic before, but since 1990, the UK economy has grown 75%, while cutting emissions at the same time by 43%. We know we have to go further, but I also know that that performance relied heavily on the private sector being able to deliver ever cheaper, more efficient and more attractive solutions for the transition. And I'd just like to note that if you spoke to our trade team, and this may come out here today, one of the strongest sectors this year that we have seen an uptick in interest from UK businesses focused on sustainability issues and on transition issues and climate change reduction solutions They have been one of the strongest sectors to come through as showing interest in exporting, being active in this region, in Singapore, and showing interest in being present here. I think that says something really powerful. So thank you so much, Brit Cham, for inviting me along. Thank you so much to all of the brilliant panelists. I'm really pleased that Connected Cities Catapult and the Cabinet Office are going to be sharing some insights, both on successes and also on some of the things that we have learnt from the ground in the UK. So best of luck for a really fruitful discussion. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Cara, and apologies for the sound issues at the beginning there. I know you've been very active in the Singapore International Energy Week, and I know the UK is ready to be engaged. So I'm going to hand over straight away to Peter Godfrey, who is Managing Director of the Energy Institute, and he looks after the Asia Pacific region for session 1, and then I will come back to you for the session 2 introduction. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Tim. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, everybody in the UK. So let me start off. This is going to be very much focused on COP26 by saying a few words about the actual event that is meant to be happening at the end of next year. And let me start by saying that effectively this year, 2020, was supposed to be a turning point in the global energy transition. The production and consumption of energy accounts for around 2/3 of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, making the energy transition absolutely central to delivering the promise of the 2016 Paris Accord. Countries this year were expected to take stock of their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to meet the Paris Agreement, and potentially strengthen their commitments to keeping global temperatures increases to well below 2 degrees, with the ambition of reducing this figure to more than 1.5 degrees. 2020 arrived with a sense of gathering momentum as the world entered its so-called decade of delivery, as many newspapers put it. But over the course of this year, we have been up against a catastrophe of global proportions, and COP26 has been postponed till November 2021. The speed, scale, and intensity of the pandemic has caught us all off guard, necessitating the reallocation of resources and a collective conviction towards limiting the extent of damaging and restoring normalcy to the economy and to society as a whole. This unprecedented extent of the drop in energy demand and the accompanying price volatilities and geopolitical implications have totally destabilized global energy systems and the markets we rely on today. At the same time, the economic dimensions of necessary infrastructure development required to effect an energy transition have significant fiscal implications for countries and will impact the livelihoods of millions of workers, not only within the energy sector, but generally within economies as we recover from the pandemic. This offers up both a challenge and an opportunity in that altering the competitiveness of renewables and other sustainable energy technologies and incentivization for greater energy efficiency is an opportunity. And sustainability, by which I mean efficiency, reliability, and resilience, are interesting elements that the world and nations as a whole are beginning to look at more closely. Now, when we look at the transition and where we were in 2019, a good test and a good measure of that is the World Economic Forum's Energy Transition Index, which actually measures 4 key KPIs, those being economic growth, environmental sustainability, energy access, and security. And it's interesting to note that since 2015, more than 80% of the countries that have been looked at, their scores have improved. So encouragingly, the Energy Transition Index is going in the right direction. And also the gap between emerging economies and leading countries and more mature countries has been narrowing in a way that looks relatively optimistic. But only a handful of countries, which I'm happy to say includes the UK, have been able to make steady annual progress on the ETI over the past 6 years. But it also demonstrates the complexity and the challenges of the energy transition. And by that, let's move over to ASEAN and the ASEAN region, because Asia as a whole holds a position of strong significance in the global energy transition, both as a producer and a source of continually rising energy demand. This trajectory has been positive here in the region, but I think everybody would admit that progress has been patchy, but with clear political statements having been made in most countries that they do want to accelerate the energy transition. Broadly speaking, the biggest challenge in the region has been how to go about facilitating economic growth and at the same time investing in the development component of the energy transition, both nationally and within a regional context. And this has been exacerbated by strong evidence that the so-called externalities, environmental and social aspects, have not been appropriately valued in this region. And issues such as how do we balance the haves and the have-nots of energy, those in more remoter locations, those that are looking for sustainable employment, increasing economic empowerment, increasing technical capability in this region need to be focused on very strongly. And that differentiates this region to a certain extent from the Europes and the Americas that have a slightly more mature and stable energy market on which to base the energy transition. So we're looking for political commitment, we're looking for national strategy, we're looking for greater regional cooperation, we're looking for stable capital and investment markets that all need to come into play if this region is going to successfully manage an energy transition going forwards. So with that in mind, these are the stakes that COP26 present us at the end of the next year. What can we do about them? What political and social leadership will we put in play? What collaboration can we offer in terms of actually making this energy transition work, not only back in the UK, but here in Asia? And without further ado, after a power cut at his home, I think he is now online, I'd like to introduce Simon Sharp, who has rapidly joined us with no electricity because I can see him in the dark. Simon is the Deputy Director for Policy Campaigns in the COP26 unit of the UK Government Cabinet Office. And before this, he was actually Head of International Climate Change Strategy at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in the UK. And interestingly, he recently co-produced a report on accelerating the low carbon transition, the case for stronger, more targeted and more coordinated international action. And I guess, Simon, that's where I'd like you to start what you've got to say to us today. How do we actually begin to target and coordinate more effective and more accelerated international action? Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the joke at my expense that I really have had a power cut in the last 5.
And your sound is off, Simon.
Good afternoon, Peter. I hope you can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Excellent. Well, hello, everyone. And I can't possibly avoid the irony of speaking to you having had a power cut just a few minutes ago. So I hope you enjoy that joke at my expense. But as Peter said, it's been a difficult year for many people in the world. It's been a tough year for many of our societies and our economies. And of course, COP26 was originally going to be taking place around about now and is now a year later. But what we've found over the past year is that, in fact, the willingness of people all around the world to act on climate change and to work together has not been in any way diminished. And in fact, we've had many opportunities like this to speak virtually to friends across the world, in many ways more efficiently than we would have done if we'd been jumping on aeroplanes. And not only that, but we're finding the time has not been wasted, that many countries in the policy actions they're taking are still moving forward. So we're hoping that when we do come together for COP26 in a year's time, we'll find we've made even more progress, and it really will be a turning point, bending the curve of global emissions. But I want to pick up exactly where you asked me to, Peter, which is how we can work together on this. you could say that the world's been working together on climate change for about 40 years. We had the first International Climate Change Conference in Geneva in 1979. And despite all of that, somehow global emissions are still going up. Fossil fuels are still something like 80% of our global primary energy supply. And in many ways, our resilience as a global society, economy, and ecology is going down. So we are far from having this under control, and we need to reverse those trends, get emissions going down and resilience going up. And of course, I couldn't go without saying that concluding the negotiations is one of our critical tasks. Strengthening the international consensus that we've carried on building up all the way from 1979 through most significantly to Paris 5 years ago. And I couldn't go without mentioning the importance of nationally determined contributions, which we are now seeing countries come out just like they promised in the Paris Agreement and set ever strong targets, trajectories for themselves. Of course, hugely significant. China doing this just within the last couple of months, setting a net zero target for 2060. And then just within the last few days, Japan and South Korea both coming out with net zero 2050 targets. So that's enormously significant. We're seeing countries really step up and convert the global targets that we all agreed in Paris into national targets consistent with those aims. Now, on top of that, we think that there is really scope for much stronger and, as you said, Peter, more targeted and coordinated international action. When we look at the sectors of the global economy that we have to decarbonize, we see each one is quite different. It's moving from a different collection of old technologies to new ones. It has a different political economy, and it has different forms of international connectivity, the flows of knowledge, finance, trade, people, goods, and services. And each of these is, as the IPCC calls it, a system transition. That's what we need, a complete switch from one set of technologies to another. And if we want those to happen rapidly, with all the structural change that entails, it will be easier if countries work together. When we're at the beginning of these transitions, if we coordinate our research and development efforts, we can innovate faster. When we're in the middle, the diffusion stage of the transition, if we coordinate our deployment policies, we get larger economies of scale, faster cost reduction, and easier transitions for everybody. And when we're facing first mover disadvantage as kind of competitive risks to movement, then coordinating on standards can overcome those and create the markets for first deployment. And we think we need to take quite a deliberate, focused approach to accessing those coordination gains in each of the main emitting sectors. So for COP26, we're going to focus very strongly on 3 emitting sectors. That's the power sector, as in energy transitions, road transport, and land use. And alongside that, focus equally strongly on adaptation and resilience and the cross-cutting challenge of finance, which we need, of course, for emissions reduction and resilience. So I want to say a few words about the power sector. Peter, please give me signals about the timing, because I want to keep to your time. The power sector, of course, what we're seeing is the beginnings, or more than the beginnings, of a rapid transition from coal to clean power. And I think it's worth recognizing how this is accelerating and how it's much faster than most people expected. If you go back to 2006 and look at the International Energy Agency projections for, say, solar power deployment in 2020, then the projection was for about 50 gigawatts. And what do we actually have now? Well, it's more like 600 gigawatts. So we underestimated the pace of change by an order of magnitude. And that's not a criticism of the IEA. The IEA based those projections on what governments themselves said they were going to do and what governments believed was possible. So governments got it enormously wrong. They underestimated their power to shift the economy by a factor of 10. Now, I think it's very helpful looking back like that, because you can look forward and expect a continued acceleration and quite likely, again, pace of change to be faster than we expected. If we look at the UK example, offshore wind, I expect everybody knows that that's one of the stories we like to tell often, because it's somewhere where we've really had some success. Back a few years ago, the UK accounted for over half of global deployment of offshore wind. And when we started doing this, all the economists told us not to. Respected economists said this is the most expensive low carbon technology known to man. And to begin with, it was expensive. We were paying £140 per megawatt hour, a significant level of subsidy. But what we've seen is over a decade, costs have fallen by about 70%. And the contracts that we've signed most recently for offshore wind, if electricity prices return to their pre-COVID levels, then this will be generating power at less than the cost of gas and coal, and in fact less than the price that we sell electricity at. So these contracts for difference, as we call them, instead of paying a subsidy to the industry, they'll actually be the industry paying a subsidy to the government at the same time as generating electricity.
Simon, I'm going to have to rush you a little bit, maybe another 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, so the pace is faster than we expected, but huge challenges still to go. What we hope to do with COP26 in the energy sector is bring countries together along with the multilateral development banks and the expert agencies like the IEA and IRENA and Sustainable Energy for All, and do two things. One is to make sure that for any country considering investment in new coal power, they can access a clean energy investment alternative that is more attractive. We should be able to do that. Wind and solar are cheaper in 2/3 of the countries of the world, costs coming down all the time. We should be able to work together to deal with those structural changes that we need to make, bring down the cost of capital, and make that the best option for every country. The second is to look at the places where the barriers to transition are socioeconomic and to face those head on, work together to support a just transition in the communities that are most reliant on coal. Those are two challenges we've set ourselves for accelerating the global energy transition. A month ago, we announced a COP26 Energy Transition Council to bring together energy ministers with heads of MDBs and heads of the expert organizations. What I would be really glad to hear from everybody else on this panel is how can we make that cooperation most effective? How can we learn from the last decade of intensive international work in this sector and work together even more effectively going forward, especially in Southeast Asia, taking into account all the circumstances of the region. So I'll stop there, Peter, but I'm looking forward to everybody else.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I hope you can stay online in candlelight over there. And without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Zulfikar Yurnaidi. Zul is the Senior Officer of Sustainable Energy, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Department and a research analyst within the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Project, which is part of the ASEAN Center for Energy. And in that role, I'm hoping that Zul will give us a little bit of an overview of where ASEAN stands within the context of the energy transition, and particularly within the context of the ASEAN Action Plan for Energy Cooperation that is being developed right now, because clearly a core component, and coming back to what Simon was saying about collaboration and increasing the pace, is a recognition that the region needs to start getting together and develop more common policy as we go forwards towards an energy transition, and that ASEAN has a greater role to play within that context. So over to you, Zul. Perhaps you could respond to some of those issues and give us an overview as where you think we stand in terms of creating more collaboration. And obviously we'd like to see the UK doing a lot more work with the ASEAN Centre for Energy within that context. Over to you, Zul.
Okay, Thank you very much, Peter, and also BritCamp for organizing this wonderful event. I'm honored to be able to be part of the distinguished panelists today. So, answering some of the questions raised by Peter, I would like to talk a little bit about the energy and climate, but also like what would be the role of ASEAN Center for Energy in assisting the ASEAN through this energy transition moving forward. So basically, our organization is the representation of the 10 ASEAN member states in energy sector, and we are guided by what is mentioned by Peter, the ASEAN Plan of Action on Energy Cooperation, which is currently we are finalizing another phase, 2021-2025, and in the previous phase we have actually 7 program areas, 2 of which are very likely connected with climate action. The first one would be the renewable energy. The second one is energy efficiency and conservation. And we have the specific target for it, the regional target. And for example, in renewable energy, we have a target of achieving 23% of renewable energy share by 2025 in TPES. And just to be fair, I would like to say there's some realities that we have to check in terms of this energy climate nexus. First is that between the climate and the energy policy, sometimes it can be seen as a silo, meaning that most of the climate policies are being made in the environment part of the government, while the energy is something else. So this silo is still there, and it needs to be bridged as well. Another second reality check that we have to do is that, as mentioned also by Simon, is that most of the countries in ASEAN is still reliant on fossil fuel, coal in power sector, but also petroleum products in transportation. And how to move forward in this just energy transition, it's very specific questions that we might have to design our own pace and our own style of energy transition, of course, while adhering to the global trends, including the climate change and Paris Agreement. And there is also some challenges if you see in the regions from the technical and financial perspective. Like most of the technologies in clean energy and energy efficiency are currently still not in place, not produced in place in the regions. We have to import it, and the capacity of the people into having this future of clean energy, it still needs to be upgraded. The same with the regulatory framework. And as for the finance, as you might know, the clean energy projects, renewable energy, and more so the energy efficiency projects, it's a kind of capital intensive projects. But in another way, the benefit is can take a long time. So from financial perspective, it's not really profitable. So we have some difficulties in some areas for us to push energy efficiency or renewable energy projects. And there is also some kind of lack of awareness. We mentioned that there's some mismatch between the climate and energy policy, but also from the people from the local communities. They still have not really aware of this climate change, even though they're aware. But what we have to realize is that in the countries with a very fast economic growth, and we're still developing, the main priority in our economic is that we need energy that is affordable, that can improve the access, and also secure. So sustainability, clean energy needs to address all of these issues at first. I just mentioned to you about some reality checks, some challenges, but there are also some inspiration, some activities that are currently happening in the region, both international level, but also in the regional level, that can shed some inspiration on how we should move forward from here. I will say with the first is the pro-climate policy. As mentioned also is that this make sure we have COP26, and a lot of countries in the regions are preparing the enhanced NDC to be submitted this year. Vietnam and Singapore already submitted, and we joined this nice climate dialogue session between the UK COP26 and ASEAN last time, and we heard from the whole ASEAN member states that they are currently preparing their enhanced NDC as well. So there are good progress in there. There are policies currently being discussed in introducing the carbon pricing. Singapore already have it in place. Indonesia is preparing their own presidential regulation for it, and the same for some other countries. So all of these climate-friendly policies are already in place, and we can see the strong role of energy in it. But moving forward, what we see is that there should be some several level of checklists. Like the first, it has to be like the higher level of target, but it has to be having these derivative policies, these prejudices, this roadmap. And going down, we have to see that the actions, the monitoring, verification should be in place for a stronger implementation of the projects. And for the second one, we also see in the regions that the clean energy, renewable energy, is actually quite resilient. Peter mentioned about the COVID-19, and we also see in the beginning of the COVID-19, a lot of renewable energy projects are being halted. Focus are being shifted because the fiscal capacity of the countries are strangled to shift the budget to the health sector. But we also see that there are a lot of renewable energy activities in the region. We can take example Myanmar, for example, which just finished their solar auction for 1 gigawatt, wholly done within the pandemic period. They start during pandemic period and during pandemic period, and they have the results all within the pandemic period. And we also have Malaysia that actually doing the same. Their large-scale solar 1 gigawatt is also being conducted currently. And we also heard a lot of good stories about Vietnam with their solar revolution, with Thailand, who tries to catch up with Vietnam, and a lot of stories coming in the regions. But the future, I think we have to see this to be more on creating the environment of the renewable energy to build the confidence within the people that we're really serious in pursuing this energy transition, and how we can scale up success cases in the regions. The third interesting thing is that the role of innovation and also creative campaign. By innovation, I mean in here it's not only in technical, but also in financing, but also in strategies. And this is actually very important, because if we want to, basically we are developing countries like maybe UK or Europe 10, 20 years ago. So we are in that level. But to do the leapfrog into the clean energy, some emerging technologies should be in place, should be conducted as a pilot, should be demoed and then scaled up. And we see there's several interesting cases in the region. Like for example, the hydrogen technology, CCUS technology are being discussed in Singapore. And there is also REC, renewable energy certification. The first REC in Thailand has just been traded from EGAT to Toyota, for example. So these kind of innovations here and there, mostly also supported by the startup companies, but also we also see that some traditional oil and gas companies trying to enter into this renewable energy market needs to be pursued and needs to be pushed forward. And in the creative campaign, of course, we also see that the youth will be very important, and the future will be very important for the common people to understand and to move forward towards this climate action. The last point that I would like to make—
Yeah, 1 minute, Zul, please, yeah.
Yes, the last point that I would like to make is the importance of coordinated and collaborative support. And this is like this discussions, the support from UK, support from Europe, and any other country will be very important. But the important thing is to be able to really understand the realities, the complexities of the regions, what is really needed, how to localization, to transfer the strategies, the technologies that work there into local context. I think that would be very important. And I believe the ASEAN Center for Energy will be playing a critical role in absorbing all of these 4 or 5 strategies moving forward, as our role as a think tank, as a catalyst, but also as the knowledge hub in the energy sector in the region. Thank you very much.
Zul, thank you so much. And you covered a lot of ground very, very quickly, so very, very impressive. I'm just going to move straight on and now begin to start addressing some of the elephants in the room, I think, when we talk about the energy transition, because I think, Zul, what you brought out were key points about the fact that clearly we are in a world where different regions are going to develop their energy mixes and their energy systems in different ways and at different paces, and have different concerns about how that energy system will be managed vis-a-vis economic growth, economic development, globalization. So another elephant in the room, and I now pass over to Stuart, who is the Chief Executive of the Energy Industries Council, is this issue around hydrocarbons and the fact that they are not going away anytime soon, but also have to go through the energy transition, particularly in this part of the world. So like me, Stuart comes from an oil and gas background. The Energy Industries Council likely also comes from that background, but is transitioning towards renewables, and as is the oil and gas business transitioning towards decarbonisation. So Stuart, within that context, looking at it from an energy industry's perspective, how do you see this transition being managed, both from the UK, both internationally, and from a collaborative perspective? Over to you, Stuart.
Yeah, thanks. Afternoon, Peter. Morning here from London, and I guess I'm the elephant in the room. So, I'm happy to be so. So I'm Stuart Broadley, CEO of Energy Industries Council. We are the UK's largest energy trade association. We have 700 member companies, which is about 20% of all energy supply chain companies in the UK. This covers all of oil and gas and renewable and nuclear and energy transition. And in fact, we came from oil and gas, but we've been in all energy for at least 20 years. So not a new change for us. What I think I wanted to, because I know you're short of time, so I'm going to cut short what I was going to say to just 3 or 4 short things. Energy transition is the topic everybody's talking about. It is the hyper topic. It's the conference topic right now. Most companies and most industries are not yet in this full new phase of energy transition, which is defined as the carbon technologies around transport and heat. So let's be clear about that. Most are still in phase 1 rather than phase 2. And phase 1 is around power, as Simon was saying. And that's the UK has made huge progress. Most countries in the world have not. So globally still for most countries, that's where the big opportunity still is. But energy transition is different for everybody. And I'm going to quote Barney Crockett, who's the Lord Provost of Aberdeen, who was one of our keynote speakers a month ago at the Energy Exports Conference, who said for any transition, each of us has to start from where we are to get to a different place. And I think that's perhaps also, Zul, what you were saying, which is transition will be different for every country and every business, actually, but it's about having that journey, setting that destination and starting from where you are. I'm incredibly excited, though, by decarbonisation actually as a wealth creator. You know, of course, it is about behaviour, but it's also about wealth, and we know this. And investors will only really pile into this when either government funds it or industry funds it or the consumer funds it. And it's estimated for the world to decarbonise by 2050. The market needs to be $2 trillion per year, every year till then, as a minimum. So just think about how often do you know that a market is coming at you, which is really that huge. And it's really going to happen. The only question is when and how. And so much of it can be influenced by us as individual businesses and agencies. So a couple of things to think about to try and answer Peter's question. Firstly, supply chain companies right now are actually diversifying. The main strategy for growth right now in this difficult market is to diversify beyond oil and gas into other sectors. 25% of companies are diversifying into renewables, so that's good. It sounds kind of like it's consistent, but 75% of oil and gas supply chain companies are diversifying out of energy completely. So they're not leaving oil and gas, but they're spreading their risk. So they're, instead of being reliant on oil and gas, they're now having investments in defense and infrastructure and pharmaceuticals and so on. This will have an impact on the skills available to bring energy transition to the fore. And Simon, trying to answer a couple of your points, that's one of the issues to be thought about in the COP26 program, is routing the supply chain and the skills. The next thing to think about is offshore wind. It really did work in the UK, and I think congratulations to the British government for their funding and policy work. But I think there was one thing that didn't work, which was to make sure that the supply chain for offshore wind in the UK was developed. So in fact, we're a major importer of offshore wind in the UK. And I think that's something to think about for any country in the world that wants to get serious about energy transition. Do they want to buy the technology? In which case governments can learn from the UK, and it actually is relatively now established on how to buy technology, how to fund it, how to subsidize it to decarbonize your country or your company. But if you want to get long-term export value from it, you actually have to do another thing at the same time, which is to develop a supply chain, develop your universities and your skills so that you have rooted capability, competitive capability for the future. In the UK, we didn't really do that properly in offshore wind. And I know the government plans to do that for these next wave of technologies. So that is a key role for government. And I think the last thing I'm going to say just in the time is Western Europe is in the lead in energy transition. And it's simply because we made the most progress in this phase 1 of technology around wind, solar, and the circular economy. We've taken it most seriously as a sort of macro region in the last 10 years since the Paris Climate Accord. The rest of the world has made much less progress. So for most of the world, still wind, solar, and the circular economy is where most of the work needs to be done for the next 10 years, and where most of the wealth is. But in Europe, yep, energy transition in transport and heat, so hydrogen, CCS, and so on is real. But it is 5 years away before the wealth cascades into the supply chain. So again, for companies looking to, to understand what energy transition means, it's key technology for the future, but still today, not enough money there. Thank you, Peter.
Stuart, thank you so much. And your segue talking about capacity building in university allows me to pass nicely on to my dear friend Willie Reid, who is in Aberdeen, but actually represents the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. So therefore is effectively the host of COP26 next year. And I'm really looking to Willie to just talk a little bit about that, about the fact that they are hosting COP26 next year and welcoming people who will be attending in Glasgow. So I'm sure he's got something to say about that. But also, again, given the fact that he represents a major Scottish university, to talk a little bit about Scotland, which is very often seen as the battery of the UK in terms of developing new energy and where it's going in terms of new energy. So Willie, we really are running out of time. We won't have time for a discussion at all. So please go through your stuff, and at that stage we will actually, I'm sorry to say, have to end the session and not have any detailed discussion given the time constraints. My sincere apologies to you all. Willie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter. If I could have my slides, I've got a few. I'm going to quickly go through these and take about 5 minutes. But first of all, let me introduce Glasgow, COP26 next year. And I have to say, before the pandemic took hold, things were very busy in preparation for this. And the University of Strathclyde was extremely busy and, in fact, oversubscribed relative to events that were about to take place. And I'm sure that will continue at pace throughout the year. So could I have the next slide, please? And so, Glasgow, COP26. Let me talk a little bit about the University of Strathclyde and what it actually does. It was nominated the UK University of the Year last year. It has 22,000 students. It got the Queen's Award for Energy Innovation, and it's very much a technological university that looks across many themes, which are in fact associated and will be associated with COP26. Whether it's advanced manufacturing, whether it's energy, which I'll focus on, health and well-being, even work regarding COVID-19 is taking place, whether it's innovation and entrepreneurship, whether it's asset integrity and measurement sciences, ocean, air and space. Just last week, we were awarded 9 million euros for a HyShip project in combination with Equinor and others in Norway for hydrogen. There are so many things I could talk about, and also society and policy, very, very important, and even sustainability. In that area, we have a £20 million programme on the oceans of the world and conservation and pollution and the One Ocean Hub. There are so many things I could actually talk about relative to the skill sets of what is a very proactive university, very applicable to climate change and very applicable to the energy transition, which I'm certainly going to talk about. Could I have the next slide, please? And it's a busy slide, but it's very important to understand it's not just Strathclyde. Everything to do with Strathclyde is collaboration. We have 200 international collaborations, including Singapore and others. And it's collaboration that actually in R&D and other activities that really is going to make the energy transition and the aspects of that happen. The areas of expertise, again, go across so many different areas, whether it's renewable energy, energy policy, environmental impact, even nuclear. But the key that I found in my 4 years working with Professor Sir Jim MacDonald at Strathclyde, is that oil and gas has a significant role to play. The interchange and the activity in oil and gas and the transition that Stuart has mentioned has been absolutely significant. And the activity in Scotland in particular, and other universities in collaboration, have been significant in this area over the last 5 years or more. So these research centres, of which there are many, one of the areas I want to highlight is power, and it is perhaps probably the #1 centre for R&D in power systems. I've heard a lot mentioned about power and how that's very important going forward. The analysis and how we actually look at the UK continental shelf of Scotland. We've participated in looking at what we call energy clusters and power distribution, etc., offshore on behalf of the Oil and Gas Authority and others in Aberdeen. Could I have the next slide, please? I'm quickly going to go through this. It's a very busy slide, and I only have a minute or a couple of minutes. But I wanted to show this to everyone of, if you like, it's a bit of an artist's impression of where a future integrated energy company is going to be. And all of the areas that have been talked about in this discussion already are mentioned. I would ask you to please look at this slide, take it away, look at all the activities of what a future integrated energy company is going to look like, and oil and gas companies with net zero operations, activities in electrification, operational efficiency, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, power, where it's going, all these different activities. This is the company of the future, and that's perhaps one of my key messages here. But as I come to my final slide, and I'm going to be very quick, Peter, my final slide, please. All I want to show is this is an example of a roadmap. Now, my message, if you like, to finish is all about adaptable roadmaps, and there will be adaptable roadmaps for many parts of the world and many activities. But this particular roadmap shows Scotland, by the way, plans to be carbon or net zero by 2045. And I would stress that's certainly a target and is embedded in UK targets for net zero. But the important thing I'm trying to mention is that roadmaps are very important going forward. And I think that you know, I can't say much more in the timescale available, but again, please look at this slide. Look at this, if you like, transition for the wind activities, the blue hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, which again hasn't necessarily been mentioned here, but which will be very important for the future. But my message in ending is as follows. Collaboration and international collaboration is critical. Clusters and how they're being developed have been very important in terms of the UK continental shelf and others in the transition from oil and gas, and that will be the case elsewhere. Roadmaps are significant. One of the key areas that hasn't necessarily been stressed is regulation. And it's very important as we head towards COP26 that we understand global regulation, local regulation, that, if you like, blends these particular activities together. And that's an important message from me. And then final, I've got government support. Working with governments, working with, if you like, strategy, communication, etc., is one of the key areas that as we head towards COP26. Peter, a very short presentation. I hope that's okay.
Thank you so much, Willie. And we have run out of time, but I'd like to give the last word to Simon and Zul, because what I'd like to suggest as a result of this very quick session, and I think Zul's opening to say, look, the ASEAN Centre for Energy really wants to collaborate on some of this stuff, and we could really talk for a much, much longer time on some of these issues, is to use this as a platform to develop a much bigger, longer session, hopefully facilitated by ourselves and the ASEAN Centre for Energy going forward. Simon, it's a step in the right direction that we would like to try and develop here in terms of greater collaboration, opening more opportunities to talk about these issues. Are you up for it? Will you help us from London develop that? And I'm going to ask the same question to Zul. I've already spoken to his boss, and I think he likes the idea. So what would you like to say about that, Simon?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to say it was great to listen to all of the panelists there, and completely agree with Zol about the need to understand the complexity of the place you're dealing with, and also with what Stuart said about needing to invest in supply chains. Very often we hear talk about carbon pricing, which is definitely a useful thing you can do, but actually strategic investment in the new technologies, the new industries, the new supply chains, that is what's actually made most of the progress across the world, not only in the power sector, but also in developing electric vehicles, which is another rapidly growing sector that we could have talked about more. So really my message to governments everywhere is concentrate on the strategic investment first and the carbon pricing second. In terms of collaboration, yes, we really want to work more deeply with countries in the ASEAN region, and we'd be very glad of your advice on how best to do that. I'm glad I was joined on this session by our ambassador, who's very recently signed an agreement with ASEAN and its member countries about working together on climate change. And we have a fund called the Prosperity Fund, which is already supporting some clean energy partnerships with about half a dozen of the countries of the region. And I know my colleagues at the embassy would be really glad of your thoughts on how we can build on that and make it a deeper and even more successful collaboration.
Thank you, Simon. Over to you, Zol, for the last word. Are you happy for us to start that conversation?
Yeah, thank you very much for connecting us, Peter. I think it's very important for us as well to work together with any dialogue partners out there, especially UK, because the offshore wind technology that's currently being developed in full over there will be very useful for some of our archipelagic countries, for example. And a lot of things that we can share, especially partly as a build up for the next year COP26. And for example, like the shortest thing that we can do is we actually have this FGD series in collaboration with UK COP26. We have Ken to be giving us the opening remarks in that session. Hopefully, during that kind of discussion, we can learn on UK case, not only UK hopefully, but also like the best cases all around the world and how we can apply that to the region in terms of policy.
Okay, well, thank you very much. A bit of business has been done, so that's a great way to end the session and pass back over to Tim for session 2. I'm sorry to the next moderators for having overrun a little bit. My apologies. Thank you very much, and goodbye from me. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And of course, BritCham is ready to collaborate, make the connections. This is very complex. And as Stuart was saying, learning lessons from what has happened already. Of course, we can't do this without finance, and that's the next section. And I'm going to pass very quickly over to Allard Nu. Allard is CEO of Infraco Asia, and he is also a member of the BritCham Energy Committee. So without further ado, straight over to you, Allard.
Thank you, Tim, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, joining the BritCham Energy and Utilities Committee Singapore International Energy Week webinar, Making Green Commercial. I'm absolutely delighted that we have a distinguished panel of experts this afternoon. And after my opening remarks, I will let each panelist introduce her and himself, including the organization which he or she represents. During this session, we will cover COVID-19 related aspects into emission standards and emissions, as well as the drive to basically improve renewable energy. And the fact is that carbon emissions have dropped dramatically, and the air is cleaner over major cities as car traffic has basically disappeared. But as demand for energy picks up once again post-pandemic, there are some large and unresolved questions about how we power our lives in the years to come. Many experts believe that this is the moment to shift our power generation and transport systems to sustainable and climate-friendly alternatives. So during this session, we will cover the options available to reduce emissions and their commercial viability. Projects will be viewed through a commercial lens, including the incentives to enable the private sector to finance and roll out associated infrastructure at scale in ASEAN, the future of renewable energy as an asset class, and the direct correlation between investments in sustainable infrastructure and economic growth. And then lastly, could COVID-19 further address climate change, sustainability, and the relation to energy transitions? Could I ask to put up the slides? Thank you very much. Next slide, please. The organization which I have been leading since 2013, headquartered in Singapore, Infraco Asia, is part of the Private Infrastructure Development Group, or PITCH in short, headquartered in London. We are a commercially managed infrastructure development and investment company, and we are now an award-winning company, including the most recent Asian Power Awards for rural electrification in the Philippines. Next slide, please. We're quite unique in the sense that we are funded by the public sector through PIDG, which has currently 7 shareholders, 4 out of which are funding Infraco Asia at present, including the governments of the UK, the Netherlands, Switzerland, as well as Australia. Next slide, please. Our mandate is threefold. We are basically developing projects where the private sector is unwilling or unable to do it on their own, but we have to do that with a social and commercial focus. So we're there to complement to the private sector, not to compete with the private sector. And we're looking at both social and economic impact in the sense that we're creating either new jobs or better jobs by implementing these infrastructure assets. Next slide, please. As I said, we are funding very early stage project development work, and we do that as a sponsor. In the 40 project joint ventures across the 12 nations where we are mandated for, we are there as a co-shareholder. We typically spend anywhere between 2 to 10% of total project value in order to get to a bankable solution. And at financial close, that's an important KPI for us. We're there to then being the catalyst to attract further private sector capital into these projects. The spend between the project's concept and financial close is largely capitalized at financial close. Next slide, please. The current landscape in Asia and the energy consumption and production of renewables is being highlighted in this slide. And as you will note, the energy consumption by sector is still largely at the industry level. So that's about 40% of the total. About 30% is currently being consumed by residential consumers, and only 1%, but we believe that will be going up given the rollout on EVs transport is only 1% of that. The proportion of renewables in the energy mix is increasing across ASEAN, and you've seen quite high jumps in those countries which have rolled out basically renewable energy targets for themselves, but also by regulation having a proper feed-in tariff regime. Next slide, please. COVID-19 responses, is it a window of opportunity, and what changes are being expected? According to McKinsey, in 2017, the world needs the report is dated 2017, the world needs to invest about 3.7 trillion annually in economic infrastructure to keep pace with the projected growth. Concluding with that, the need for resilient, sustainable infrastructure is now greater than ever before. Next slide. What we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic is CO2 emissions fall and fossil fuel use declined. But the big question is, are these trends staying with us? From electricity giveaways to virtual end-to-end fracking, the global lockdown has seen a huge change in the way we create and consume energy. But as demand for energy picks up again, there are some large and unresolved questions. How about we power our lives in the years to come? Next slide. And this is the end of the presentation. This is just an overview how countries within ASEAN have set themselves targets to be able to meet their renewable energy targets. End of slides, please, and the rest of the panelists on screen. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce the next panelist. I'm going to turn to Audra Lowe first. Audra is the CEO of Clifford Capital, and she will introduce herself. Audra.
Thank you, Allard. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Audra Lowe. I am the CEO of Clifford Capital. For those of you who have not heard of us, we are a specialist provider of structured finance and project finance debt solutions. We serve as a policy lender for the Singapore government, supporting Singapore-based companies in the infrastructure and maritime sectors that are looking to invest in or export to overseas markets. This is similar to what export credit agencies and Exim banks from other countries do, except that we operate strictly on a commercial basis. We are a part of the Clifford Capital Holdings Group, which is in turn owned by Temasek, the Asian Development Bank, and a number of other banks and insurance companies, including Standard Chartered, DBS, Prudential, and Manulife. We have, in the last 8 years of our operations, financed a wide range of infrastructure and energy projects around the world. This includes the first internationally financed independent power plant in Myanmar, wind farms and solar plants in India, and the world's first floating LNG vessel that was financed entirely on a commercial basis. We are particularly proud of this last project, where one of Singapore's leading shipyards, Keppel Offshore and Marine, has taken a very old LNG carrier and is converting it into a brand new floating liquefaction facility that will support the liquefaction and LNG export needs of Senegal and Mauritania for the next 20 years. It has cost less to build than a new build vessel, and it has given us a great example of how we can live in a circular economy, repurposing assets rather than tossing them out in the junkyard. Like many of you, we at Clifford Capital are committed to supporting a transition into a greener and more sustainable future. As a policy lender, we see great opportunity for us to do this, as many Singapore-based companies, like SIEW and Infraco, have set their sights on bringing more sustainable energy solutions to the region and to the world. I'm sure Lawrence and Allard will speak a lot more to this later on. We believe that financing has a meaningful role to play in driving adoption for sustainable solutions and practices. As governments and countries work together to develop new concepts and new businesses, from microgrids to regional grids, distributed power to virtual PPAs, our aspiration is to keep up with all of this from a financing perspective and to come up with new financing structures that can help deliver these new ideas in a commercially viable and affordable manner. I'm looking forward to a discussion today with my co-panelists on what all this could entail. Back to you, Allard.
Thank you very much, Audra. Well done. Can I turn to Aditya Agarwal, who is CEO of Singapore for the Global Infrastructure Partners, GIP.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And firstly, thanks, Allard and British Chambers of Commerce for having invited me to share my thoughts in this panel. As Allard mentioned, I am part of the emerging markets team at GIP, based out of Singapore. And as some of you may be aware, GIP is one of the leading international infrastructure investors and very, very active in renewable space. In terms of numbers, we have around $70 billion of assets under management that we manage for third-party institutions. And more pertinently, we own and operate more than 20 gigawatts of RE capacities across the world. Now, that is a number that not too many people are familiar or aware of, but I wanted to share that with you to kind of give you a sense of the scale that GIP operates in this particular space, straddling across various technologies, including offshore wind, which is relatively nascent as compared to onshore and solar. Now, GIP's investment approach is also very, roll up your sleeves and focus on operations kind of philosophy. which has manifested in a number of our relationships and joint ventures with some very large industrial majors globally. Now, coming to decarbonization, of course, it's a huge theme for all investors, including GIP, focused on infrastructure sectors. Since historically, many of the large industrial and infra projects across sectors, given their nature, have had a fair bit of carbon footprint, right? So therefore, the same sectors also provide the most significant and near-term opportunity to reverse the legacy. Now, today, I'm looking forward to listening and getting insights from my fellow panelists on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditya. Next on the panel is Andrew Johnston, who is the CEO of Climate Fund Managers. Turning to Europe. And Andrew.
Good morning, Allard, and everybody. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Good morning. Great to join you all. I'm representing Climate Fund Managers. It's a new fund manager focused on blended finance in renewable energy and water, and the water and the ocean space. It's a joint collaboration between the Sanlam Group of South Africa and FMO, the Dutch Development Bank. And our purpose is to use blended finance as a technology to mobilize capital into emerging markets directed at climate impact. We've been running for about 4 years. We have roughly $1 billion under management. And over this period, we have managed to put 6 projects into construction in jurisdictions like Djibouti, Vietnam. We work very closely with Allard and his guys in the tougher markets. And it's fantastic to be here. Great to share thoughts and experiences. Looking forward to the chat.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Next is Lawrence Wu, who's the president and co-founder of one of our joint ventures, SIEW. Lawrence.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, I'm Lawrence. I'm the group president and the co-founder of SIEW. It's a pleasure to be here. SIEW is actually a renewable distributed utility company. So it sounds like a mouthful, but effectively we construct, we own, we develop, and we operate solar power plants across multiple of stations. And what's the difference between us and the big gencos clearly is we don't have a big gas-fired power plant or coal-fired power plant sitting anywhere. We have about a few thousand stations scattered all over the island and all over ASEAN as well, powering green. On top of that, we do a lot of energy efficiency, and EV charging is the latest gig that we hope to electrify, and thereby saving even more carbon emissions from ICEs itself. My day-to-day work really comprises around making a project commercially viable. So I get very often sandwiched between the professional billion-dollar investors like Aditya and the institutional financiers like Audra, and of course, Allard yourself as an impact DFI, right? And getting clean energy sources to not just developed countries like Singapore, but also developing neighbors in the ASEAN region. Allard.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And last and definitely not least, let's turn to a commercial banker, Jonathan Drew, Managing Director, ESG Solutions at Hsbc.
Allard, thank you very much. And thank you also to the British Chamber and SIEW for inviting me to join this discussion. Like Lawrence, I'm the other panelist whose first name doesn't begin with the letter A. But delighted to be here. My role at HSBC, as you introduced, Allard, is to lead our ESG solutions group. So what does that mean? Well, it's very much focused on providing solutions for across our wholesale client group. So very much thinking about our clients, all of whom are facing what we might call this huge sustainability challenge or the need to transition. They're taking actions, and many of those actions require financial support to implement. So that's what we do. So that takes us into the area of all of those sort of themed and labeled financing transactions, green, social, sustainability, the products, financial products that have incentives embedded into them, the sort of sustainability linked bonds and loans. We're also helping clients through the sort of the minefield of how do they deal with ESG ratings and where does their disclosure sit versus peers. And the objective of that, of course, is to best position them as a sort of a representative of the sell side to get best access to the buy side, who are increasingly focused on this, whether it's banks under pressure from regulators or institutional capital under pressure from asset owners to really be managing capital with ESG at its core. And of course, that takes us across the whole range of clients, from at the sort of the individual asset level, sort of project financing work, through corporates, and right up to supporting sovereigns as well, who are obviously a key component of providing capital to support the development of sustainable solutions.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And let's turn to the panel discussion. The impact on COVID has been mentioned a couple of times in regards to emission standards and the drive for renewables. And the first question which I have, particularly for Andrew and for Jonathan, does the COVID-19 crisis offers an opportunity for policymakers to build a clear pipeline of greenfield and or brownfield expansion projects in emerging markets in Asia? Andrew, maybe as your name starts with an A, as Jonathan already highlighted, you first.
Great, thanks, Allard. So the answer is simply yes, absolutely. I think what we're seeing as a result of COVID is a concentration of focus. We had quite a long period of time where the SDGs and this pursuit of climate outcomes started aggregating thought around parts of the investment spectrum that existed for quite a long period of time. And then I'm talking about infrastructure investing, impact investing, different sectors, and they're all being coalesced around the SDGs, which sounds, there you go, the SDGs. I think what COVID has done is it's actually slapped two things. One is a sense of urgency on top of all of that coalescence of ideas, but it's also brought a sharp recognition into, one, the effects of the deficiency of infrastructure, so the inability to respond to the requirements of COVID, be that through real infrastructure, hospitals, distribution networks, or whatever on the one hand, and secondly, infrastructure is now coming back to its original place, which was a catalyst of economic growth. And so increasingly we're seeing, as a consequence of infrastructure, a more focused recognition of the role of infrastructure. And it's almost like 10 years ago, where infrastructure was the sort of the holy grail of GDP growth. It's now getting back into that zone, and I think that's good for everybody, because there's lots of technology available for financing infrastructure that we can then hang the climate and impact aspects around it. So I think policies driven by infrastructure, driven by real assets that that people understand and that they can actually apply existing models to, I think we're seeing it much more as the center of policy formulation, and we think it's a good thing.
Thank you, Andrew. Can I turn to Jonathan?
Yeah, no, Allard, look, thank you. And look, I completely agree with Andrew. I mean, firstly, I think we have to recognize COVID is nothing other than a tragedy playing out in many different ways, but it has done certain things, including, I think, wakening people to the reality of just how vulnerable we are and how fragile our systems are, and therefore that we need to change. And we've seen evidence of that just in for example, the volume of financing that's been labeled with a COVID theme. More than, we have a fast growing green and social bond market, up more than 50% on last year. And the notable feature is that globally, more than 40% of that has been social or sustainability, recognizing obviously that the impacts of this particular ESG risk are very unfairly distributed. And we could say the same about climate risks and other ESG risks. And in Asia, the figure is 50%. And it's mostly the banks, but it's also sovereigns and some corporates recognizing that sort of money needs to behave responsibly in what it supports and how it responds and reacts. And of course, part of that then thinking, well, what are the other risks out there that are driving this fragility? And of course, climate change is probably the biggest beast of them all. So, and the tragedy, in a sense, regrettably, we haven't really probably seen the beginning of it, because we are sort of still in the midst of this health crisis, but we are heading very likely into a consequential financial crisis. And I'm thinking here particularly, obviously, how, for for example, the sovereigns have had to shore up their economies, the furloughing schemes, etc., etc. Many of them have borrowed to do that, and that debt is just building up on sovereign balance sheets. And if you look at the low-income countries, I think just over the period of the 10 months of this year, debt to GDP of low-income countries has gone from 40% to 60%. So we have a massive problem that's being built up. So thinking about, okay, build back better, well, you know, the problem we've got is we've got to deal with the current debt burden as well at the same time. So there's a lot of effort, I think, going on, and going to be responsibility in the financial markets to assess, to support the sovereigns, because of course, as we all know, in Asia, there's still a lot of that infrastructure, the green infrastructure that Andrew talked about, that's being built and developed by sovereign entities or sovereign-related entities, of course, like yours, Allard. So we have to support the sovereigns, but of course, then to the sort of the topic of this conversation, and sort of where I can stop and pass to others, is obviously saying, well, shore up the sovereigns, but then we have to find the right methods and the right platforms to bring private capital into play so that we can create that sort of economic recovery, green growth, and rebuild. And a note of hope from around this region is something that I noticed sort of pre-COVID coming out of Indonesia. Probably the only government in the world who, when they put their NDCs out there back in 2016, had a sort of a 29% versus BAU reduction and a 41% if they get financial support from the West. But when you look into their planning modeling and then you correlate those carbon scenarios to the growth potential, it's the high carbon scenarios, the business as usual, that has the lowest growth. And it's the low carbon scenarios that are driving the highest economic output, because of this recognition that climate change will just destroy the productivity of land, of people, of capital. And that's, I think, the message we sort of need to get back to you know, help people understand that's where we're going to make the productive investments.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And let me stay then with governments and reforms, and turning to Audra. Audra, are governments implementing reforms quickly enough to reduce emissions, support sustainable and clean energy projects?
Well, Allard, I think we're still in this very early stage of energy transition, and certainly more can be done on the parts of government. I think in the last 5 to 8 years, there are many that have already taken the first step by making firm commitments to have more renewable power generation capacity in the country. Initially, there has been a need to provide subsidized feed-in tariffs to make this happen, but increasingly with solar and onshore wind already at grid parity, subsidies are already not necessary in many of these markets. But fundamentally, what we still need in order for these projects to happen, especially in developing markets, is bankable projects. And as Jonathan says, you know, in order, the governments alone are going to be saddled with a lot of sovereign debt, especially coming out of the pandemic. How can they mobilize more private sector capital to continue investing in the green sector? They would then need to absolutely focus on ensuring that they are putting out bankable projects and concessions, because fundamentally, bankability issues don't go away because we're transitioning to renewables. It's still very much there. For example, in frontier markets like Myanmar, the government is just as committed to clean energy as their more developed counterparts have been putting out 1 gigawatt type tender programs. But in order for them to do this in a scalable and also in a very bankable way, they have to address very fundamental issues such as land acquisition. Until these fundamental issues are sorted out, it's going to be very difficult to attract credible international parties into these markets, which is so very much needed to speed up the pace of clean energy adoption. I think aside from sort of talking about bankability, where governments can also come in, particularly in other slightly more developed markets, are in adoption of new technology and approaches. So in this part of the world, at least, you know, distributed power is still reasonably new. And just as grids have to be designed to support the two-way intermittent load, appropriate policies will need to be rolled out alongside to make sure that there's a coordinated and methodical implementation of this type of new ideas. And maybe let's just take a step back. notwithstanding the current strong interest to go green, I think fossil fuels are still projected to supply something like 80% of primary energy needs by 2040. And that's still way below the 50% level that's needed to achieve net zero by 2050, which is the Paris Agreement target. To achieve this very ambitious target, we need to electrify everything. We need to adopt clean energy, and that would include new fuels, including green hydrogen. We would have to implement, to some scale, carbon capture and storage technologies. And considering many of these technologies haven't also achieved commercialization, again, that's where the governments have to step in. So I think from my perspective, there's still plenty to do for the governments, I'm afraid. And of course, that would sort of happen in different forms, depending on where the countries are in the development life cycle.
Thank you very much. Lawrence, at SIEW, you have, obviously, you were a startup 10 years ago here in Singapore, but you've, over the years, expanded elsewhere and have been dealing with these government's rules and regulations as well, still completely focused, obviously, on solar. So have you got anything to add to what Audra already shared with us?
Yeah, I think I just want to take a lead from what Jonathan and Audra said earlier. As a result of the pandemic, I think the issues around the bankability of emerging economies hasn't changed. But what is also accelerated is that apart from building on top of centralized models, there is the acceleration for decentralized models, right? And decentralized models in the project financing perspective is even harder to finance as compared to a standalone project financing, single off-taker, and then we can go on and on about how credible this off-taker is, regardless of whether this sovereign agency is. But imagine you have 10,000 villages and you want to power them up with renewables and batteries and whatnot. That is even more challenging. And I think at the moment, what we can do is, a lot of it is unfortunately financed on our balance sheet, but ultimately we want to look towards the structured finance type products in order to be able to let other forms of private capital, including the banks, to come in and take it. But it is a both a challenge as well as something that we think would continue to power the growth in a post-COVID environment. And this is the kind of stuff that we think should be powering the post-COVID environment.
Excellent. Aditya, let me turn to you and move to technology. Is the pandemic accelerating the adoption of technology to improve project delivery, and if so, where?
No, absolutely. I think never has been a time in last 20, 30 years that one has seen the focus on technology, especially in infrastructure, than ever before. And, I would like to slice it into two parts. One is when you are kind of, looking at setting up these projects, how technology helps to accelerate development and construction activities. And second is the newer technology development that helps one to kind of optimize the operations as one gets along the management over the next 10, 20 years. But, Allard, before we kind of get into technology, I just wanted to supplement a little bit on what Jonathan and Audra had mentioned, if you permit me to do so. In terms of capital flows, I think there is absolutely no dispute in terms of the fiscal deficits and, the kind of challenges the governments in the region are going to see. But I think what we have not talked about, which is equally important, is the liquidity sloshing around in the system with the institutions, right? So you actually have, on one hand, the demand for capital in the region, and then you have the supply of capital, which is trying to find a home and looking for the right frameworks, which gives them, the institutional investors, such as Audra and Jonathan in the banks, to provide, that capital. So in that context, again, there's not something very dramatic than the regional governments need to do. It's just going back to the first principles. In terms of, firstly, I would say the strong government support has to be exhibited by whichever state one is talking about. The senior most politicians, the policymakers, have to come out and say, this is what I believe in, this is what the roadmap for next 5 years is. And some of the countries in the region have demonstrated that. I think that provides a lot of comfort to institutional capital coming in. Second, which is a near-term thing, is around project pipeline. I think if we get to have across countries a near-term project pipeline that the governments can come out with, And I would talk about not marquee projects, but something that are easily implementable in next 3-6 months, rather than these gangbuster kind of projects which will take next 5 years to conceptualize and implement. So that would be another big thing. And then the whole project award process. And I think Audra did mention in terms of making it simpler for the project developers and investors. I think risk allocation is another thing that most of the policymakers need to focus on. In terms of land acquisition, again, one of the panelists talk about. We have an example in India where the government has created these solar parks and have kind of provided connectivity along with land to the developers. So that kind of risk allocation, which is optimal, that private sector kind of handles the risk in terms of construction programs and O&M, is something that they handle, and change in law and land acquisition is something that the state can provide a helping hand. I think those are the things will be quite well placed for policymakers to focus on in the near term.
Thank you. And let me turn to all the panelists for the next question. What do you think can be done to ensure funding for renewable energy projects? Given the potential budget constraints, which Jonathan already alluded to, is there an opportunity to further enhance private sector participation and private sector funding and or public-private partnerships? Audra, can I turn to you first?
Sure. So I think it does really come back down to bankability, isn't it? So when we start from there, then that wall of liquidity that Aditya was talking about is going to be unlocked. But beyond that, there are hanging issues such as creditworthiness of some of the weaker governments, for example, and maybe that's where some of the multilateral development agencies have a hand in helping alleviate and to bridge this gap. So I think some of these things would go a long way into making a lot more of these projects happen. But I do think that the conventional model, as Lawrence was saying, is also evolving, right? As we move towards smaller projects, much more distributed projects, there's also a shift towards much more commercially oriented projects where we're not looking necessarily at state off-takers, that it can be underpinned by more commercial users, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think many financiers also may have to shift our mindsets, right? Thinking about how we can consider whether or not cash flows can continue to be as resilient as if it was underpinned by a long-term PPA. So yeah, I think lots to do, but I'm sure there are ways to come across to overcome them.
Right. Andrew?
Thanks, Alan. I was actually going to make exactly the same point. I think we need to look at infrastructure in a slightly different way. I think the funding models need to evolve from the old definition of infrastructure, which was reliant on a strong nexus to government and physical monopolistic characteristics. I think you now need to rely on the new world of data, information, new forms of intelligence. We need to rely on the disaggregation of delivering that infrastructure service into the hands of the people. What telcos did, what power is now doing, and what water needs to do, to actually put that infrastructure service delivery really down at the lowest common denominator of the population of societies, and find business models through technology that actually solve this challenging bankability. I think we need to redefine bankability, and I think it is actually happening. I'd say that in a forward-looking statement, but I think it is actually happening, and I do think that the way that money is moving and people are conceiving and dealing with risks is evolving. So I'm encouraged. While on the one hand, I acknowledge the massive challenges that we face, on the other hand, I do think as a sector and as a bunch of professionals, we're well equipped to actually respond to these challenges.
Thank you. Lawrence, as an owner and operator of a whole range of assets, your turn.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Andrew and Audra said earlier. I think it's a more of an appeal to the, I suppose, regional governments, in the sense that when you look at putting projects together and inviting private capital participation, and I think to seriously look at a bit more of a sovereign guarantee in the wraps around giving private capital the assurance that the sovereign will be there to work things out if things doesn't go their way all the time. And then thereafter allowing the sovereign to at least free up the necessary free cash and resources pump into other aspects, especially of what's needed now, and attracting private foreign direct capital in. That's as far as the big projects are concerned. I still don't have an answer if it's very distributed in nature. In fact, if I had 10,000 residents in Singapore living in public housing, and then I go to Jonathan or Audra and say that, can you fund me on 100 megawatts scattered across 2,000 locations, and I'm powering 10,000 homes? You'll stare at me with a very big eyes.
Right. Before I join to Jonathan to address that, let me give Aditya a chance to share his views.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did touch upon in my earlier remarks, but I think one more thing that one should keep in mind is whenever these programs are rolled out by whichever government or state that one is talking about, I think policymakers sometimes lose sight of the fact that it's the entire ecosystem that they need to think through. So right now, if you look at the region, people will talk about solar program or a wind program, but let's say there is not enough focus on transmission capabilities or smart grids. Right, 2 years down the line, when you have all these capacities, and Lawrence, I'm not talking about decentralized because that takes care of those kind of issues in a much nicer way. But I'm talking about utility scale projects that a lot of policymakers focus on, and when these programs are midway in terms of a significant capacity having come through into the grid, then the transmission network starts getting wobbly. So that is one example of not thinking through the entire ecosystem. Another one is institutional capabilities around whether there exists enough in a country to around spares management or operations and management, talent wise, or even otherwise. If you're talking about 5 gigawatts in next 3 years in a particular country, are we geared up for managing that whole capacity, not from a technical standpoint, but even otherwise? I think that's another area apart from capital that one would be well placed to think about.
I'm sure we can cover another session on that.
Absolutely.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but the floor to you, Jonathan, for closing the panel.
Well, that's very kind, Alan. And look, I'm very happy to and pleased to hear Lawrence's sort of challenge around the sort of the allocations of capital, because I think we've all agreed that the liquidity is there, and we know the projects that needed to be funded, and we somehow need to connect them and find the sort of the risk appetite. And I think the challenge actually is, and this goes back to the sort of the thought leadership coming out of Indonesia, is that it's the perceptions around really where the risk is. And we heard it on the last panel. People started off with these really conservative assessments of how much renewable energy capacity was going to be built. But if you start to do those sort of look forward exercises and think about a world through transition, and how we're going to have to decarbonize, and therefore what we are going to need, where the demand's going to come from, we will start to actually change the perceptions of where the risks lie. And I completely accept Lawrence's challenge that a lot of that you have to do within your own institution to actually change the perceptions and the mindsets to make sure that you're doing your bit before we start saying, and I think one of the damaging things or most negative and least constructive things is the sort of the tendency to point fingers. Oh, we can't do this till the government does this or that, but actually to sort of look within, what can I do? How can I challenge my institution? How can I make a difference? And if we all do a bit of that, I think we're going to collectively make a big difference.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Lawrence, Audra, Andrew, and Aditya for your insights and sharing that with the participants. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Allard, for that session. And in Britcham, whenever we do events on energy, we always involve the financial community because we recognise how important finance is to enabling this. With that, I'm going to hand over to Thomas straight away on successful decarbonisation projects. We've got some good case studies. We're not just going to look at the technology, but we're going to look at some of the business models that are evolving. And really, some of these projects are all about creating a business model for scale. I know we're over time. I would suggest, Thomas, that you take the time that you need. If we go 10 minutes over, we go 10 minutes over. That's the joy of a virtual session. But let's hand over to you straight away. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Allard, and to all the panelists that we heard from just now. Some very interesting perspectives from the finance community and earlier from the background of CARA and why the imperative is to change while we have an opportunity with COP coming forward. So good afternoon or good morning to those in Europe. Thanks for joining us so early. My name is Thomas Brio and I'm energy leader for Arup in Southeast Asia. Arup's an engineering consultancy working across APAC and the world. So thanks also to SIEW for arranging this conference, and to the British Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore for putting together quite a stimulating event. As you've seen, we've had a lot of speakers to get through, and as we've heard from CARA and Singapore ministers earlier in the week, there is a lot to be done in creating the policy and enabling environment to create a stimulation for real action. But action only comes on mitigation climate change when real projects come to life and are implemented to reduce emissions. So I'll shortly ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and give a 3 to 5 minute description of a particularly interesting decarbonisation project that they've been able to make a reality. And then after that, we'll have a quick fire panel session. We may be able to run a little bit over time, we shall see, but we have a number of panelists to get through. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andy Ross, and if I could ask for the slides to be presented now, please.
Okay, thanks, Thomas, and thank you very much for inviting me to the panel today. So I am the head of Sembcorp Energy UK. So we're part of the Sembcorp group out of Singapore, and our purpose is to play a part of creating a sustainable future for a sustainable future across the world. So from Sembcorp's perspective, we have 12,600 megawatts of capacity. 2,600 of that is renewable, and there's a continuing trend to move away from fossil fuels to renewables. And what I wanted to do was just touch on a case study in the UK. So we own and operate a site in the northeast of England around Teesside. This is home to petrochemical companies. It was formerly the home of ICI, and we supply a lot of power and steam to those companies. And if you go back before Sembcorp joined, this was all coal-fired. So Sembcorp acquired this business in the UK in 2003. Coal-fired power was obviously a fairly significant source of energy generation in the UK. And actually what Sembcorp did was back then was say, well, look, we want to move away from coal. We want to start thinking about decarbonisation. And this was before the carbon tax was introduced in the UK. It was before the UK government mandated the closure of coal. But what was really important when we talk about renewables globally, most people tend to focus on solar and on wind. And actually the critical issue for our customers on site was to have a reliable, dispatchable source of energy for power and steam. And therefore the concept of building a biomass power station came into being. And you can see in 2007, this plant was built. It's 35 megawatts at the time. This was the largest and the first large-scale biomass project in the UK. And it can provide that dispatchable, reliable source of power and steam to our customers. We source our material in the UK from the UK Forestry Commission, and also we use recycled wood. So all of the fuel is sustainably sourced, and we get through about 300,000 tonnes a year. And compared to what we were doing on coal, that was about 200,000 tonnes of CO2 saved per year. So for a relatively small plant, that's a significant saving on site. Biomass is a very difficult fuel to handle versus coal. So there were a lot of learnings, and actually what was great about being part of the wider business was there was a cogen biomass plant built in Singapore, and we were able to share a lot of the learnings from doing that, because there's a huge amount of experience and data on coal generation, but not on biomass generation. And the UK is actually a specialist in biomass generation. About 5% of all electricity generation in the UK does come from biomass. The final point to make is we did this under the support mechanism provided by government called the Renewable Obligation. That support runs through to 2027. And as I've said on the slide here, this is the start of the journey. I mean, Colin will talk about net zero Teesside, but if carbon capture and storage does come to Teesside, there is the possibility that we could have a negative emission plant here if we were able to capture and store the CO2 that the plant generates. So again, a very exciting technology and absolutely critical to deliver net zero in the UK.
Thanks, Andy. Jan, perhaps you could introduce yourself and then hand over to Herman, who I understand will talk through an example from Shell.
Yeah, my name is Jan Huiling. I'm the Energy Transition Business Opportunity Manager in Shell Pernis. It's located in the Netherlands in Rotterdam. We are one of the largest refineries in Europe, 400,000 barrels. And we are quite busy on the energy transition. The low-hanging fruit, energy savings, district heatings, we already implemented. So we are on that scale quite energy efficient. And it's our aim target basically to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. So from Shell Pernis by 50%, if economically affordable. Besides that, we put a lot of focus on improving the carbon intensity of our fuels we sell. We have quite some programs. At the moment, we are looking on the whole variety, which was just described by Audra. So we look basically to items which at the moment are quite out of the money, using green hydrogen and electrification. At the moment in Europe, not affordable, but shorter to being implemented are biofuels and CCS. And Herman can explain at least on the Portals project, CCS, what we are there doing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jan. My name is Herman van der Meijden. Together with Jan, I lead Shell's participation in the Portals project. I'm normally a government relations advisor in Shell, and as I will show, this project is a big collaboration between state-owned entities and private parties in the Rotterdam port. Thomas, if you could flip me a slide to the next one, we can illustrate what the Portals project is. I think I would like to echo first what Jan said. We're speaking here about CCS, but this is part of a broader strategy to transform the business of Shell in the Netherlands, as the Netherlands is aiming to be climate neutral by 2050. We're also investing in offshore wind. We're investing in electric driving in our retail stations. We're investing in geothermal heat. So there's many more angles, but certainly to achieve the objectives in CO2 reduction for 2030, Portals CCS is quite critical for us. We're only a customer. There are 3 state-owned entities who are developing and will build the infrastructure. That's Hsbc, the national grid operator, the Port of Rotterdam company, and EBN, the state energy company. And 4 companies of the refining cluster in Rotterdam jointly being the launching customers. It's quite a material project. If you look at overall emissions in the Netherlands, it's 180 megatons per year. Portals will sequester 2.5 megaton per year, so it's definitely sizable on the scale of emissions in the Netherlands. And there's a heavy policy linkage, like Andy has also been describing, for the business case of the biomass plant. Also here, what we see is that there is a combination of European support from the Connecting Europe facility, which is granted to the Portals consortium, so to help develop the transport and storage system. And the customers will also apply for a national subsidy called SDE++ to help them bridge the business case from the European CO2 price at the moment to the cost of doing this project. Now, you introduced it, Thomas, as successful projects, and that asked for a bit of modesty. If you move to the next slide, because in terms of, the project definitely is a reality and is very real and quite advanced, but the construction still needs to start, as you can see from the timeline we have here. So we are driving for an investment decision by all parties next year. You can see with 7 parties involved, 4 customers who have to build capture facilities, and then the consortium that needs to build the transport and storage system, and all these have to come to that final investment decision at the same time to make it work. So from an organizational complexity, this is very collaborative and tedious as well. We have to be honest, but so far we're on track. And then in the course of 2024, we should see the first injection of CO2 going underground. If you look in this timeline, I think a key moment has been in 2018, the Netherlands Climate Accord. This was when the government convened many stakeholders from industry, NGOs, and others to devise a way how the Netherlands would get to its CO2 reduction goals. So the goals for 2030 and 2050. That also contained a joint fact-finding process with NGOs. Greenpeace participated, and some other more local NGOs. I was personally also in there, and there basically the acceptance that CCS is a necessary part of the mix of measures to make our energy transition was reached, and was important to help build the societal license to operate for CCS, which certainly has not always been there, and has also paved the way for the national subsidy scheme to be broadened, such that CCS projects can also apply for it. That's this SDE++ scheme. So overall, a project in the works. We are, as Shell, very committed to keep progressing it. Many issues, both on the technical side and also on the commercial side between the parties that we're still working out. But I guess that's part of these type of groundbreaking collaborations for the energy transition.
Thank you very much, Jan and Herman. So if we could skip forward to Colin McGill's slides. Colin, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Zero Carbon Teesside. You're on mute currently, Colin.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Thomas. My name is Colin McGill. I work for BP. I'm the project director for Net Zero Teesside. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks very much. I suspect many of you are aware, but carbon capture and storage is absolutely vital to the world's desire to control climate change. So, for example, the IPCC has estimated that somewhere between 5 and 10 billion 5 billion tons a year will be required by 2050 to reach the Paris goal of less than 2 degrees. And they've also done more studies which indicate that if you don't do this, it makes it almost impossible to achieve. And if you do achieve it, it's much more expensive. So carbon capture and storage has got a vital role in allowing us to do this. And if you look at why that hasn't happened in the past, they've all failed for basically the same common reason. And I'm not just talking about in the UK here, I'm talking about around the world. They failed because of lack of government support. The reason people don't decarbonise is not because of a lack of willingness, it's because of a lack of business models. It costs more to produce a decarbonised product in general. There are a few exceptions, but generally it's cost more to produce a decarbonised product than a non-decarbonised one. Unless there's some way of paying for that, you just can't go forward with the project. So that the business models that we're working on with the UK government, they're the most important things, because if we get those in place, that will allow us to apply at scale in the UK. But perhaps more importantly, the UK has got a tradition of exporting its regulatory regimes around the world. And whenever I speak internationally, I'm often approached by local government officials who are very keen to understand those models to see if they can be applied in their own region. So, for example, the contract for difference that the UK applies for offshore wind, that can be applied to actually help us generate low carbon electricity in the UK. and also to decarbonise industry. And they're also looking at a regulated asset base, which is a way of model that the UK uses to regulate infrastructure like the national grid and sewers. We're looking at that as a way of regulating the national infrastructure on CO2 injection. So those models are sort of beginning to be in place, and we're working on properly. If we can get those in place, though, I am confident that those models will be picked up around the world. And to give an example of that, you know, the UK only last year declared that it wanted to be net zero by 2050. As a result of that, 50% of the world's GDP has got plans in place to be net zero by 2050. And that's probably out of date now, because you've seen this is before the declaration by China and before the declaration by Korea. So, you know, the UK taking a leadership role on this can have a much bigger impact than just in the UK. It can actually help in the rest of the world. And if there are any regulators listening, you know, my message to you would be, you've got to get the business models in place. Businesses are desperate to invest, but they can't do it if they're going to lose money by doing that. You've got to help them find a way to do that. If you go on to the next slide, please. So as Andy mentioned, Teesside used to be an ex-ICI site. And because of that, it's kind of an integrated chemical site, and it's pretty compact. It's only about 10 kilometres in diameter. So that makes it very straightforward, actually, to build a gathering system to actually collect the CO2. So the idea is to collect the CO2 from a range of industries and inject it, compress it, and send it offshore and store it safely in the North Sea. So one of the interesting questions though is, why did we choose Teesside for this? There are lots of places in the UK. I think the initial study looked at like 140 sites. One reason was the fact that it was compact, but there's also very strong political and industrial support. So you've seen Andy talk this morning. Semcor are part of a group of about 4 or 5 companies who are very keen to decarbonise their products. There's also very strong local political support. This comes under just one local government with a mayor who's very supportive, and that makes it simpler. There's some of our colleagues are looking at Humberside, and Ecuador is leading that, and it's more difficult, it's more challenging. It comes under 3 regional authorities, each with their own agendas, and they don't quite overlap. So that makes it hard. It's much simpler having that one local authority to deal with. We've got some very interesting companies that are very keen to decarbonise, some of which produce very high concentrations of CO2, or in some cases pure CO2 already as a byproduct of their chemical processes. So we've got about 750,000 tonnes a year coming from hydrogen and a fertiliser plant. And of course, that makes it very cost effective to decarbonise, because all you've got to do is take the CO2 and compress it and store it. Perhaps what's also interesting, though, is that the Teesside is the second biggest industrial emitter of CO2 in the UK. It emits about 3 million tonnes from industrial processes, but it also emits about 3 million tonnes from non-recordable emissions which you don't have to pay tax on in Europe. And if we can capture the CO2 from that, like Andy was saying, there's some at his plant in Semcor. If we can capture the CO2 from that, it gives us negative emissions and negative carbon electricity. And it's the fact that there's so much of it in Teesside that it actually allows you to get to net zero relatively straightforwardly. And we think we can actually make this whole thing decarbonised by 2030. There's also a bit of spare capacity in the hydrogen plant. And not only that, because it's an ex-ICI site, there's actually a hydrogen distribution system right the way around the site. So we think also there's a fantastic opportunity to try out hydrogen fuel switching here very cost effectively. And all this will be underpinned by a power station, a gas-fired power station with CCS. And there are 2 very important reasons why this is a big part of the project. The first is that the UK needs it as part of its energy system. As you're probably all aware, the UK has got lots of offshore wind, and that's growing. And that's great. We should have as much of that as we can. But of course, there are days when it's not windy and you need a backup. And so what we've been working on is a gas-fired power station with a carbon capture plant at the back that can be turned on and up and down as and when required to balance the wind, to balance the variability in the wind. And that it turns out that's really important. So if we're successful, we'll have the world's first industrial decarbonised hub as soon as 2030. We'll have the first dispatchable low carbon power. That's never been done before. It's always there kind of when you, it's always only there if it's sunny or windy. And we'll also have the world's first negative carbon electricity. So it's a very exciting project for the UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Perhaps I can hand straight over then to Henry. Could you tell us a little bit about connected places, please?
Hi, thank you, Thomas. My name is Henry Che, the Director of New Mobility Technology. Next slide. We are one of the 9 catapults in UK to support the businesses in transforming great idea into valuable product and services. We are a network of technology and innovation centres established by the UK government as an independent, not-for-profit organisations to help to deliver impact across the UK economy, enable businesses to thrive in the global market. My team mainly focusing on the commercializations, addressing barrier on adoptions and design improvement in a range of active projects, including connected autonomous vehicles, mobility decarbonizations, unmanned air systems, port transformations, and intelligent transport systems. All of these are aimed to support the creation of intelligent and connected mobility space that meets society, current challenge, and the future. Next slide, please. One of the main focus on for Connected Places Catapult is about connected places and people looking from a holistic view that enable the economic growth. Clean mobility is one of the key focus which make difference to our future. Next slide. The UK government have set a net zero target by 2050, which is equivalent to net emissions of greenhouse gases by 100% relative to the 1990s level. As you may be aware, the time scale cannot be met just through applying latest technology. It's also about changing our social behavior, modal shift, and the way of living, and the commercial model that we're currently operating in. Next slide. So as part of it, we have been continue working. Back the slide. Back again. Yep. So we are continue working across the sectors. And one of the areas we have been focusing on is working with the authority, the government, the industry, and the supply chain, and try to identify an area that is challenging. And one of the areas that we think is challenging and also will be potentially impactful to the contribution to the net zero target is addressing the heavy goods vehicles. One of the things is we need to study and understand and working with the operator and the service provider an incentive to adopt, as the margin in this sector is low, but current carbon emission is high in the road transport area. Once this area is addressed, it can be slowly adopted by other type of vehicle as well, which is supported by the infrastructure already in place. Another thing we also need to ensure of is the production of the energy sources in the area that able to the production is cleaned. You may think hydrogen that we've been talking around may be cleaned, but it's how it's actually productions. It could be quite environmental and friendly. Lastly, we need to ensure the system is sustainable. Next slide. And worked by our economists and the technical experts with the authority and industry, we have identified 2 most practical solutions for the UK environment, which is heavy goods vehicles supported by electric road or powered by hydrogen. We have developed a plan supported by a number of key stakeholders at this moment in time. It is not just a technology demonstrator, but a design of an end-to-end pilot for heavy goods vehicles that could be adopted by the logistic industry. with including the consideration of infrastructure, the way the logistic industry ways of working, the operating model, the running costs, and the technology enhancement by the car manufacturer. Number of locations we have identified with consideration of practicality and affordability. Engagement currently is ongoing for the pilot rollout, which aim to establish supply chains and stimulate mass development and product of zero-emission heavy goods vehicle technology for the UK. I think we have moved on significantly from a few years ago, where we are still in discussion on where shall we start, to now with a focus that we have become a coordinating lead partner, working with wide stakeholder, supported by a holistic analysis from a social, economic, technology challenge. I think we have come a long way. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. So without further ado, let me hand over to our last speaker, Willie Reid from the University of Strathclyde. Please could you tell us a little bit, Willie, about one of your projects?
Okay, thanks. Could I have the first slide, please? Anyway, before I go on to my presentation, I just want to say I'm very familiar with the Wilton site and Andy's presentation. I founded a business, or co-founded a business in gas to liquid technology, and in 2005, and raised quite a bit of private equity on that. And we in fact built a prototype system on the Wilton site. So I'm very familiar with that, and I'm very familiar with prototypes, some of which I'm going to discuss. Secondly, you know, and the Proteus site, again, what I'm going to say is very complementary to many of the presentations we've seen today, and certainly from Herman and Jan. As far as Colin's concerned, fantastic. Relate, you know, it gives a nice build up to what I'm actually going to talk about, and the collaboration required from the various parties. And so I'll miss out the bit on the rationale for these things and CCS. And for Henry, I just wanted to say that Aberdeen in Scotland has been running for the last 7 years or so, one of the key major European projects with hydrogen buses. So Aberdeen has 8 hydrogen buses and has got significant experience on running these buses, and I relate significantly to your presentation, Henry. So without further ado, could I have the next slide? So what I'm going to do here is explain what is a complementary project to most of the ones that have been discussed here today. And first of all, I'd like to thank Pale Blue Dot from Aberdeen for allowing me to use this example. And also, I want to highlight that Scotland, in particular, because of its location next to the sites for storage that the oil and gas industry provides, is actually a very good location for a CCS facility. And this history goes back a long way. In fact, at the time that Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair, there was a £1 billion at least project planned at St Fergus with BP, which was since shelved, and that goes back a long way. And to be honest, the UK has looked at CCS for a long time, and I'm very pleased to say that there are a number of sites now being looked at in clusters, and one of those is in Scotland with the Acorn Project. So what is the Acorn Project? Well, it's actually again supported by Shell as one of the partners. Total is one of the partners. Chrysador is one of the partners, but it will be project managed by Pale Blue Dot. As again, if you look at the project plans for Proteus and with Colin's facility, it takes time for the various regulations and authorizations to come through. But this pilot will be operational in 2024. As a general summary of this, this is a pilot for carbon capture and storage. It utilizes what are world-class stores for CO2, well proven, well analysed by University of Edinburgh. By the way, Strathclyde works in collaboration with Edinburgh University and others in a Nexus project, which is evaluating 9.6 million tonnes a year, which would, if you like, be utilised within this facility, taking in, if you like, connectivity within Scotland. The other thing that's very important is that as this goes into the GoldenEye pipeline and the facilities there, basically there's a cost saving of around 750 million quid as a result, and that's a lot of money, as a result of the reuse of high capacity offshore pipelines. This is a very interesting project in terms of it combines all of the skill sets that we're looking at the energy transition. We're looking at an initial facility which will look at 200 tonnes of existing capacity, but also we're looking at taking CO2 from the INEOS facility in Grangemouth. But the key thing that is also very important here is that we have a deep water port in Peterhead, and because of that, if you look at the current, methane as LNG and various, is transported around the world quite readily in vessels, safe, high quality safety, etc. The same applies to CO2. And in reality, you have the Ruhr Valley and the hub of CO2 production in Europe, which could be transported in vessels, where they're planning a design facility to accept that CO2 in Peterhead, which again is a new unique feature of this part of Scotland. So you don't actually have to have the, if you like, the CO2 on site. I'm going to finish up by saying, thanks again very much for the opportunity to present here, and I hand back to Thomas.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks to all of you. I know you were being pressed hard behind the scenes to keep to time, and apologies to the audience for running over slightly, but all very interesting presentations. I would like to ask you each at least one question, but I will ask you to give me a quick fire 1 minute answer. So coming to you first, Colin, what is it that's really going to fund zero carbon Teesside? Is it bill payers of the products that are produced there, or is it taxpayers? And how quickly can we move from the case where these things need to be paid for to the case where it can be self-funding, if you like?
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, it's got to be paid for by somebody. As I said, it generally costs more to make a non-carbon product than a non-decarbonised product. And for electricity, you can pass it on to the consumer. There are mechanisms in the UK to allow you to do that. But for other products, that's not possible. So imagine you're an ammonia producer, you're selling a bulk commodity product. It's not actually possible for you to pass that on to the consumer because it's bought by another chemical company. He won't pay that. So until consumers start demanding low carbon products, that mechanism is not possible, or you have to put in a carbon tax. So until that happens, the most likely solution is that the taxpayer will have to pay the difference above the cost of a carbon tax. So, for example, supposing it costs you £80 a tonne, you get 25 euros a tonne because you're not paying the European carbon tax. Somebody's got to pay that difference. And if you don't want the industry to go out of business, that's actually got to be the taxpayer. So at the moment, that's the model in the UK, but other models are indeed possible. So it's only going to be it'll become self-sustainable when the carbon tax is sufficiently high, when that becomes the right thing to do without a subsidy.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, and I accept that for fuels. I think we've managed to prove that for electricity generation, as you say, we can actually produce that cheaper than any other form. So coming on now to you, Jan, if I can ask you a similar question as it relates to Shell. What is the one big thing that your company has to do to make the type of solution that Herman talked about mainstream?
You're talking about CCS. The thing we are basically have to do is to connect to that CCS installation in portals. The things we are at the moment looking is indeed capturing from our hydrogen manufacturing plants. We have an existing one already up and running, connecting at the moment to the greenhouses. We want to make that dual. So in summer, they use a lot of the CO2, don't use their heaters and make that happening. Subsidy we, for the time being, need is basically to get us at a level playing field with the rest of Europe, ETS. So basically, the Dutch government is supporting us to at least start it. Once basically the ETS price is at basically the Dutch levy price, so the higher imposed taxes, I think it starts becoming self-funding, and we don't need any subsidy. And at the moment, we are looking how we can all make that work. First, it's technical stream. We are quite far, and I think that within, say, the next 2 to 3 months, we have all the plans completed. And second thing, then you ask, when is it self-funding? When could it work? It's basically when the European energy trading scheme, the CO2 price, hits basically the cost price of the Portos project. From that moment, I think there is no subsidy anymore required. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's great. It looks like there are lots of reasons why the European carbon price needs to rise. We'll see how soon that occurs. So moving to you, Andy, we've heard a bit from Colin about what he thinks it takes to make a zero carbon industrial cluster in the UK, as well as from what Semcor are looking at achieving there. Are there elements of the project in the UK that you think are replicable here in Southeast Asia's energy transition?
I do, and obviously Semcor as a whole runs Jurong Island, which is a much larger example of what we have at Wilton. But I think the other thing for me is, we talk about enabling the net zero future and getting down to net zero emissions. And I think what we've heard a little bit about is a lot of the drive is around wind and solar, which do have intermittency. And increasingly in the UK, we also have increasing issues with system stability. And so one of the other things that we're looking at Semcor, we in the UK, we acquired a portfolio of assets from UK Power Reserve. These are fast response gas engines. We also have batteries as well. And I think what you've heard over the last few days, and I think the Energy Minister mentioned it, was the need to combine renewables with storage. So how do we have a complementary system so that when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, we still have that backup? And what we're doing in the UK is we have 60 megawatts of batteries as well. We are building another 60 megawatts. They're increasingly being used to provide a number of system support services to keep the grid stable. We are seeing, as big thermal plants are coming off the system, that the system is less stable than it was. And this is something I think the UK is ahead of other markets, and I think could be repeated in other markets as well, because I think we've seen it in Australia. I think others are recognising with renewables you need those complementary services as well.
Thanks, Andy. Henry, I've got a simple question, at least from a technical perspective, or it sounds simple, but perhaps the answer isn't simple. What's going to win out in Singapore? The hydrogen fuel cell vehicles or EVs?
Well, in the UK, hydrogen has been seen by many as an attractive prospect for large vehicles. It is relatively energy dense, and the refueling experience is like diesel. Electric vehicle, on the other hand, achieve great efficiency. But recharging at home can be easy, but it takes longer time. The batteries are heavy, and charging them take a long while. But it's also suitable for all vehicle types, especially on some of the commercial vehicles. I think it is much more of an energy system decisions, because in Singapore, I know the power plant is at its capacity for the current demand. And then it's a trade-off whether there's plentiful supply of the clean hydrogen that we've been talking about, or good quality EV charging network that are available, and then also with the infrastructure in place in the need of this in the Singapore of the parking space and consideration. So I don't think it's a straight answer that I can give you at the moment.
I'll be honest, I didn't expect one. But yeah, no, it's interesting to think about EVs in the context of Singapore and the fact that actually it doesn't have any indigenous renewable energy, and therefore actually what it's likely to do is import hydrogen to generate electricity. And if it then puts that through a battery, it seems like the round trip efficiency gets even worse, even though it's much better with battery vehicles generally. But perhaps that's for another discussion. So Willie, from a technical perspective, what do you think successful projects need to demonstrate to be replicable worldwide?
That's a very good question. For me, you have to look at the team that's being put together and the collaboration that actually makes it happen. For example, we've seen examples here today of a number of projects that, without, if you like, the support of oil and gas operators that really, and I use the term performance while transitioning. At the end of the day, we depend on the skill sets of, for example, oil and gas operators and others to make these things happen. And they have, if you like, certain technologies and experience to bring. But the reality is that who is going to operate these things? Who's going to actually take the thing forward? Are there companies out there? Yes, in CCS, for example, there's probably quite a number of successful projects worldwide. All have had certain amount of government support. There's very few, but the reality is that Shell have tried it. There's a number of projects in Canada and elsewhere, etc., that we can learn from that process. But all of these, if you look at it internationally, have in fact brought a team together that makes a compelling proposition, which does in fact attract the funding to get these giant, and I call them giant pilot facilities, but in reality, they are the examples of the future. So as far as the UK is concerned, we've got fantastic examples where we've got the oil and gas operators who want to transition, who are extremely able in adapting strategy. It's quite a challenge, who are combining with private entities and, if you like, local entities and clusters in the UK. And I think I would emphasize the word cluster and collaboration, because obviously you have to find the site that is suitable for this. That's number one. Does it actually tick all the boxes relative to the technologies that if you like, are coming together? But in a nutshell, for me, it's the leadership of that, the team that understands the process of how pilots and how things are put together, and actually there's the regulatory element which comes in as well. But the key is collaboration between these multifaceted groups.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And coming then nicely on to my last question, and apologies again for the overrun. So Herman, from your experience, if there was one request that you had of policymakers and governments around the world to make these projects mainstream and enable us to achieve our zero carbon 2050 targets, what would that be?
Only one, Thomas. That's challenging. No, I think there's a sequence, I think, which if you want to get serious on addressing your emissions and mitigating climate change, set your goal, put it in a law, and make it firm, such that there's no debate anymore on the direction of travel, and that emissions have to go down, and that you're serious about doing so, and that you will put the policy package together to make that happen. I think it's a very important and indispensable first step. And then the second is, how are you going to then do that? And then you have to look at it broadly across the sectors of your economy, and you have to look at your package of projects like the ones that we've been showing today, that you need to get there. And you will find probably that CCS is in there, that electrification of fleets is in there, that hydrogen fleets is in there, that it is a sort of an all of the above strategy, certainly if you go for net zero in 2050. And then I think you need the collaboration that Willy talked about. Convene your stakeholders, convene the ones that have the skill sets to make these things happen. Don't do it all yourself as a policymaker. There's no pointing. I think the way that we did it in the Netherlands, we have this transition in building our dikes to fight against the sea, which we call the polder model. We convened all the stakeholders. You put Greenpeace and Shell around the table. It's always fun. But I mean, yeah, you have to jointly work out with all the stakeholders how you're going to make it happen. And what is then, and that is the crucial last step, what is the policy instruments that create the business case such that investment can start flowing? And yeah, it's a three-step recipe. It may sound simple. I know from the last 2 years, very painful experience, that it is far from simple. But I do think if you follow those steps, you can really get there, and you can get your investments moving, and you can start moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, great. So the two things I think I've learned from all of you, from Colin, from Herman, from Henry, from Willy, from Andy, thank you all for your contributions. Collaboration and a stable carbon price, it seems. Back to you, Tim, and apologies for the overrun.
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks to the speakers from the last session. We tried to bite off more than we could chew in the 2 hours, so apologies for everyone who is still listening in. But it really is an imperative, climate change. But beyond that, the imperative, as I see it, is developing the commercial opportunities, developing the business models. It's not all about technology. It's around, as we heard in session 2, financeability and bankability. We also heard in session 1 about lessons that can be learnt from the UK around developing a supply chain around industry, such as the offshore wind. The UK, of course, is very happy to share these stories. And in Britcham, you know how to get in touch with us. My name is Tim Rockwell. I'm chairman of the Energy Committee, but please do get in touch with us. One of the things that I've learnt working around the world over the last 25 years is that there's no copy-paste approach. We can't just take from one region and paste it into another region. So here what we're trying to do with Britcham in Asia is to develop solutions in Asia that are applicable for Asia, but learning from what's happening globally and share those ideas back to the world as well. So with thanks to the Singapore International Energy Week for allowing Britcham to host this session, and for everybody in the background, and of course the Energy and Utilities Business Committee, and the team behind the scenes at Britcham for helping to pull all this together. With that, I'll close the session and say thank you very much, everybody. Good night.